Let's pray. Guys that are collecting the offering, they can keep their eyes open. Father, thank you for this opportunity to be here. Thank you for where we live. Thank you for the people we live with, and thank you for the love you show us through them. And I pray that we would just recognize you in all of that, that you are the one who loves us, and you love us through other people. Thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, James, can you just light me up over here? And not because I need to be in the light, but it really messes with the video if I'm not. So, we're starting this series, Habits of a Healthy Heart. And how is your heart? For some of us here this morning have pretty heavy hearts. Some of us here this morning have some happy hearts. Where are you on that? As we look at what it is that helps us have a happy heart, we're going to talk about the habits that do that. There's an interesting story. When Jen had somebody who was working for her who did some sewing for her in her business. And I don't even know how the conversation came up, but something about, have you ever lied? And I don't know how that came up, but her answer was, I've never lied. She said, my dad, this isn't Jen's answer, this is the person she was talking to. My dad told me when I was just a kid that if you tell a lie, you spend the rest of your life covering up that lie. Right? And I think there's great wisdom in that. She was also the person who signed an agreement for her rent not to smoke in her room, and it was filled with smoke. So, but the point she made was interesting. So my question to you is, do you lie? And if you say you don't lie, I say liar. The question that goes along with that is this one. When you lie, who do you think you lie to the most? Right? Is it your friends? The one that invites you over somewhere and you say, oh, I'd love to come, but I'm doing my hair, or whatever it is, right? Do you lie mostly to your friends just not to offend them? Do you lie to your employer? Those days that you just, it's too nice to work. All right? And suddenly you have a little ache in your tummy. Do you lie to the people you care about the most? When you say, oh, it's going to be all right. Who do you lie to the most? And what's interesting is that if you do a little bit of research on this, and some of you will not be surprised at all by this answer, the answer to this question is the person you lie to the most is you. We lie to ourselves all the time. How many people entered this year going, I'm going to start going to the gym, or I'm going to start eating healthier, or I'm going to start reading my Bible every day, I'm going to spend more time in prayer, I'm going to start caring more about my neighbors? And how many of us just don't follow through on that? What's absolutely amazing to me and is so counter to how I think we should think, how I think we should act, is that we are our worst enemies. We are our own worst enemies. We tell ourselves something. Depending on how we are wired, we will tell ourselves some of the most hideous things like, oh, you're just so stupid. Or, whatever. Maybe it's about your appearance. Or you just can't do this. We are our own worst enemies, and we lie to ourselves more than we lie to anyone else. Now, Jeremiah writes this. He says, it's a message from God, and it's, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Beyond cure. Who can understand it? And as I look at this, I go, I don't understand it. I don't get it. I don't get why we are actually self-sabotaging so much. But it's kind of just who we are. And it's a human condition that we exist in. Now, if we want to change our lives, it isn't making a new resolution. If we want to change our lives, if you want to change your life, you need to change your habits. If you want to change your life, you need to change your habits. But how do I change my habits? Well, if you want to change your habits, you need to let God change your heart. Because we are driven from our heart, and yet Jeremiah says that our heart is deceitful. And yet so much about who we are as created beings is in our hearts. Your whole body could fall apart, but that doesn't mean you disappear. There is something within you that needs to change. And how do we change it? Well, we change our life by changing our habits, but we can't just simply change our habits. I mean, some people can bear down, but it has to be driven by some greater purpose than just, I want to change my habits. And if we change our habits, we've got to let it come from our heart. And if our heart is in a healthy place, it pushes out into the rest of our lives, then our relationships start to become healthy. And our interpersonal exchange about ourselves becomes more healthy. There are a few habits of healthy hearts that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. We're going to be talking about this week. We're going to talk about the habit of self-examination. We're going to talk about the habit of simplicity. We're going to talk about the habit of solitude. We're going to talk about the habit of sorrow. Everybody sign up for that week. We're going to talk about the habit of slowing. And in all of this, we're going to be looking at how to have a healthy heart. Because if we have a healthy heart, then everything starts to get healthier around us. If we have two people in a marriage who are working at improving the health of their heart, it will improve the health of their marriage. It's going to take two. Everybody knows that. This week, as we look at the habit of self-examination, there's a verse, it's a psalm. David writes this psalm. It's in 139, and it starts off with, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me." The God who created you knows you. You know when I sit down and when I rise. I got a new app on my phone that tells me when I've been sitting too long. It knows when I'm sitting. It also knows when I'm rising. I don't know why I mentioned that, but you perceive my thoughts from afar. God perceives my thoughts from afar. Just let that settle for a little bit. When you're angry at God and you're not trying to show it, God already knows it. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. And then he goes through this whole passage about how God knows everything about us. And the interesting way that he concludes it is this. He says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." And God already knows my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there be any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So David has this psalm, he has this discussion with God. He says, you know everything about me. You already know it all. It's not as though I need to go, hey God, I'm a little angry at Bob today. Not this Bob. Right? God already knows that. Sometimes we need to say it so we know it, but God already knows it. It's not as though God needs to know what we're thinking. The whole point of this whole psalm that David writes is in the conclusion. You know who I am. You know who you designed me to be from everlasting. Help me get there. Help me become the person you designed me to be from everlasting to everlasting. The God of all creation knows you. David wrote this. David is known as a man of God's own heart. And in David's younger years, it was absolutely amazing how he trusted God in everything. Right? And if you know the stories of David, he became king eventually, but it wasn't an easy track to get there. He's just this shepherd boy. And we read that he took the responsibilities of caring for the sheep like to the nth degree. He fought a lion, he fought a bear over sheep. And it was because of those things that he had to face in his everyday life that when Goliath was standing on the other side of the battlefield, yelling at his Israelite comrades, at his family, this relatively young boy was able to say, send me. Not because I can do this, but because God will help me do this. It was this, in the life of David, the idea of him having the heart of God is pretty impressive. He actually just relied on God's heart to lead him. He believed that God wanted the Israelites to be free from the Philistines, and he believed that God would allow him to do what needed to be done to make that happen. He just trusted in God. He writes these incredible things, all of these incredible passages about what it is to trust in God. The Psalms, largely the book of Psalms is written by David, this poetry. This warrior king who killed 10,000 people is this incredible soft-souled artist who plays the harp and writes poetry. What an interesting guy. And as time goes on, David is told he's supposed to be king, but he refuses to take it by force. He eventually becomes king. He survives the attacks of Saul, his king, who he refused to kill, though he could have done it easily many, many times. He just believed he was to be king, and he believed that God would make a righteous way for him to become that. There were all kinds of ways that he could have stolen it, but he refused to do that. That's the heart of David as he's growing up. But what happens, and what happens to many of us, is that we actually see what God has done for us, we trust in what God has done for us, and then we get to listen to people telling us how good we are, or maybe you do, and we start to believe that we actually accomplish those things. That, you know what, David, I don't know if this is exactly what David thought, but David, from the songs that were written about him killing Goliath, he could have started to believe that if he hadn't killed Goliath, Goliath wouldn't have been killed, which isn't true. God would have raised up someone else. David is simply the vessel through which God accomplishes his will, the same as you and I. But what happens is you start to think that it's all about you. And David, in a time when polygamy was very culturally acceptable, almost expected within royalty, David settles into this lavish lifestyle in the city that's called the City of David. And he is served by many people. His armies are victorious. And we run into this passage in 2 Samuel chapter 11. It says, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." At what point in our lives, now, hear me on this, I'm not talking about being a workaholic, because that's a sin and a disease as well. But at what point in our lives do we think we deserve something because of what we've done in the past? Right? At what point do we think that we deserve to be treated better because of what we've done in the past? And it's a natural thought pattern, but it's also a disease. At what point do you go, you know what? I've given to the bridge for so many years. I think they should play my music. Right? Or I think they should be interested in putting money in the things that I care about. At what point in your life do you think you deserve more respect because of the things that you have done? Because that's the point that David finds himself at. He's like, I've gone off, I've killed, I've led armies, I've done what I've got to do. It's spring, I'd rather stay in my feather bed. Right? And it's at this point in all of our lives where we start to go, well, I deserve a little more, whatever it is, because of what I've done. That Satan starts to work within our lives to lead us to things that we never would have actually desired when we were walking as though we had the heart of God. All right? The story goes that David is and you probably know this story, David and Bathsheba. David is supposed to be off fighting battles, but he figures he deserves a break. So he's in his castle, he's up at night. He has many wives. And he's up on looking around and he sees Bathsheba, who's bathing on the roof a distance away, but he can see her and he is attracted to her. And the word that's used for David saw Bathsheba is a word David stared at Bathsheba. David didn't just go, oh, there's somebody, and then go on with his day. David fixated on Bathsheba. And the story goes that he goes, so, just curious, asking for a friend, who lives at that house over there? All right? And his advisors say, well, that's Bathsheba. That's the wife of one of your trusted 30 men. And David's like, oh. And you can't necessarily follow the whole thought process. But even before David asked the question, he shouldn't have been there to ask the question in the first place. All right? But then he goes on this track where somehow he convinces himself that, you know what? Maybe I should invite Bathsheba over. I don't know how you get there other than complete arrogance. Maybe you convince yourself that, well, maybe I should care for my buddy's widow and have her over for tea. I don't know. All I know is that David thought he was justified in what he was doing. And as David goes on, what happens is the story starts with lust, it leads to adultery, it leads to deception because they sleep together, Bathsheba gets pregnant, and he tries to cover it up. And then, in order to try and cover that up, he gets Bathsheba's wife to come home, sends a report, convinced that he would go sleep with her, and then everything goes away. All right? We can cover that up. But this guy is more dedicated to the work of David than David is. He refuses to go home while he is in Jerusalem. He sleeps with his men. He sleeps with the servants. He says, it doesn't seem right to me that I should be at home sleeping with my wife while all of my warriors are out there in the field sleeping in the mud. What would have happened if David had that attitude to start with? All right? Leads to deception, leads to murder, and it leads to this massive cover-up. And David, the guy who used to function under the heart of God, is a guy who now functions under perception. Because if he looks good, then things must be good. So he ends up marrying Bathsheba. Nobody knows whether the child is his or not his. It's probably Uriah's, right? This poor widow has lost her husband. David invites her in to the castle. What a hero. How do we shift from understanding and functioning under the heart of God, believing that God gives us everything, that God gives us our tasks, and we are able to function because God equips us to do what He calls us to do? And then, how do we slide into, it really matters what people think about me? Well, I'm the king, so, I need to have kind of this stellar persona. At what point in your life do you start to believe that you deserve more respect because of the things you've done in your past? Because that's the point where we start to move away from the heart of God. David, what happens is David is covering this up. A period of time goes by. The baby that David and Bathsheba have dies. And he's sitting there. I don't know what David is thinking. I can't imagine that he's functioning in a happy heart kind of way. And this prophet Nathan comes along and says to David, and he just breaks into this story. Like, David is justifying everything he did with Uriah and with Bathsheba and with this baby. He's able to cover it up and hide it from people. And he thinks that everything is okay as long as he's hiding it from people. And then Nathan comes along to David. When he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, a rich and another poor. One rich and another poor. And then he tells this story about this poor man had one little lamb that he loved. The lamb lived with him in their house. His family loved this little lamb. That's the poor man. The rich man has thousands of sheep, all at his disposal. A visitor came to visit the rich man, and the rich man said, take that poor man's lamb and kill it so we can eat it in celebration of our friendship. It's a story about a lamb. Now, what's the answer to that? What's the solution? The solution is that at a minimum, the rich man has to give the poor man some sheep to replace that sheep. Right? Like, that's sort of if we're in the right mindset. But David burns with anger. He goes, that is horrible. I can't believe anybody would do that. That rich man's got to die. Going, what? And Nathan looks at David and says, yeah, it's you. And it's not about sheep. It's about Bathsheba. Isn't it wild? Just think about this. That David, in his mind, can justify the whole lust that leads to adultery, that leads to murder, that leads to a cover-up, to lead to all kinds of deception, and he's okay with that, and he's not okay with somebody taking someone else's lamb. This anger burns in him. It's because David knows all along that what he's done isn't right. And although you can cover it up, it's really not about what other people think that determines whether you are functioning in a healthy heart. It doesn't matter at all what other people think. It's about you and God. David writes Psalms after this experience. He confesses his life is a mess because of this. But he writes many Psalms, I believe, talking about the experience that he had when he drifted and what it looks like when he comes back. As he talks about evil people, he says this, in their own eyes, they flatter themselves too much to detect or hate their sin. Have you gotten to that point? Do you actually think you are justified in every blown up relationship in your life? Do you actually think that you are justified in every time you say something bad about someone else? Do you think you're justified in your anger? If we flatter ourselves, we believe we deserve more. We deserve more respect. We deserve whatever it is. All right? I've put so much into this family. I can't believe that they don't, whatever, remember my birthday. Be gone with them. Right? This, what I find interesting in this journey of David is that this self-deception, this self-flattery, it manifests itself in 5 major ways. Craig Rochelle has put together this list, and I think it's a really good list. It goes like this. Addiction to distraction. Addiction to distraction. We distract ourselves, truth about ourselves. What is it when if you were to actually map out what your day looks like, and you were to go, I spent, an hour eating, I spent 7 hours sleeping. How many hours did you spend in distraction? And I need to tell you, social media is a distraction. All right? How much time in your day do you spend in distraction from your life? All right? Now, I think reading's great. I think you should be reading. But are you losing your life in whatever you're reading? Is that your distraction? Some of us get distracted in, tinkering. Wrenching, whatever that could be. Some of us just need distraction, which is crazy. And I'm as guilty as everyone else. I'm not standing up here saying I got this figured out. I send a lot of reels to Jen. It's because I love her. But the fact is, you need to kind of weigh everything out. How much time are you spending just trying to be distracted from whatever is going on in your life, rather than dealing with whatever is going on in your life? Another way is manic cheeriness. The idea that you need to put on this happy, happy face all the time whenever you're around people, but the smile disappears as soon as people are gone. You know what's nice about a happy, cheery face? Nobody says, "What's bothering you?" We put on this mask so that we avoid having to deal with real questions from people. Are you manic, cheery? Cheery? Are you cheery manically? Judgmentalism. You know, I can remember over the years, the greatest criticism about other people's marriages often came from somebody who was just about to lose their own. You get involved in church and you're dealing with silly things a lot of the time. But that's been my observation. The fact that people who are most critical about whatever it is, kids playing hockey on Sundays, have their own issues that are going to walk them away from church. It's just about to happen. Are you extremely judgmental about something? Odds are you are judgmental about the things that you are struggling with the most. And it's our weirdness, it's how we're wired. We look at people who are struggling with something that we are struggling with, and we are super critical because we just want them to hold it together because we hope we can hold it together. What are you most judgmental about? Another thing, which is similar, slightly different, is defensiveness. What offends you today? I had to think about this with my own self as I was going through this. What am I most offended by? And you know, this is personal, but I get offended when people criticize my character. Like really, really, really offended. Which helps me understand that I have priorities up here on how people see me, way more than I care about what God thinks about me. If I am super, super offended because people criticize my character, then I need to look at where my values are in relationship to God. And being cynical, everything's wrong, and everyone else is the problem. Do you know any people like that? I do. And you know what? What's interesting is what I've found, and it's interesting, is that people, when they're involved in a church or in other organizations, they love to blame whatever is going on in their own lives and point it to something that's going wrong in the organization. And that can happen in family too. Are you, when you look at this list, do you see any of yourself in there? Is there anything that kind of pops out to go, yeah, okay, maybe that could be me? Think about that. Here are 3 warning signs. When God is speaking to you, when we are asking God to search us and lead us and test us, He often responds this way. Watch for what others have tried to tell you. All right? What in your life have others tried to tell you? You know, in your life, what is it? Have people told you, you really need to start slowing down a little bit? And does that keep coming back and back? And do you justify what you're doing by saying, you know what, you just don't know how important I am and I need to keep doing what I'm doing? But it's a warning sign. What are people telling you? I want you to think about that. What have people told you, whether it's your mom or whoever it is in your life? Watch for what you rationalize. Can you rationalize the horrible things you say to other people because you think you're justified in saying them? What is it when you look at your life and you think about what you've said or what you've done? Ask yourself, how do I justify my interactions with other people? And number 3 is watch for where you are most offensive, like I was just talking about. I believe that God is speaking to us about the health of our heart, and I believe that God is speaking to us through these means. The more convinced you are that you don't have a problem, the more likely it is that you do. No surprise in that either. You know, as I'm talking here, are you going, yeah, I can probably miss the next few weeks. I have 0 issues with my heart. And you can't change what you won't confront. So what is it in your life that God is speaking to you about? That we are going to develop a habit of self-examination, a habit of looking at ourselves, not listening only to what other people say, but listening to how it resonates with the voice of God. Because David came up with this pattern to help us. He says, okay, God, search my heart. Try saying that to God. Search my heart. And test me. God, what I really want you to do is I want you to poke me in that vulnerable place so I can see what it is. Test me. Poke that sore spot. And then it says, see any offensive way. How do I respond to the poke? And then lead me. I want you to rest in this. I want you to think about that and answer this question. What is God saying to you? I'm going to ask the band to come up. They're going to lead us out with this song. Just create in me, this is David. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. Are you willing to dig in and see where God is wanting to change you now? If you want to change your life, change your habits. If you want to change your habits, let God change your heart.